So today we are diving into the, let's call it the strange world of municipal budgeting.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We're looking specifically at the proposed 2026 consolidated budget for the city of Victoria. And this thing is not small. It's clocking in at $468 million. But the financial figure that's caused the most, well, disproportionate amount of outrage, it's just so much smaller.
It's tiny in comparison.
We've been digging through the stack of reports and local commentary you sent over, and the whole emotional conflict, the thing dominating the conversation, is a proposed cut to the city's iconic hanging flower baskets.
Right. They call Victoria the Garden City.
Yeah, exactly. And now the flowers, which are, central to that whole identity, they're on the chopping block.
And that, right there, is the perfect example of, let's say, political theater versus fiscal reality. The fundamental question running through all these sources is this one. Is this massive, almost hysterical public debate about flower baskets actually just diverting attention?
Diverting it from something bigger.
From a far larger, and I'd argue, potentially devastating structural financial issue.
Okay, so let's lay out the key details right away just to anchor this whole discussion.
Good idea. So on one side, you have the proposed property tax increase for 2026. It's 10.44%.
A double-digit hike.
A double-digit hike. And residents, critics, they're rightly calling it unaffordable, financially reckless. But on the other side, the thing that's consuming all the oxygen, the cut to the flower basket program, saves a relative pittance, just $130,000.
Okay, let's unpack this right now because the optics are genuinely staggering. I mean, in the context of almost $500 million, saving $130,000 it's a rounding error.
It's statistically meaningless. You blink and you miss it.
Yet, by cutting this one specific, very visible, and deeply emotional feature, a feature that literally defines the city, they generate this massive, distracting headline.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources we reviewed are, well, they're highly critical of this. They call this exact scenario a prime example of performative budget discussions.
Performative budgeting. It's a strategy, or at least critics allege it's a strategy. It's designed to pull focus away from the true shocker.
Which is that 10.44% tax hike.
Exactly. It's the classic political sleight of hand. The strategy is supposed to go like this. You roll out a truly alarming, double-digit tax increase proposal.
Right.
The public is incensed, but they focus their rage on something concrete and visible, the flower baskets. Then the city graciously listens to the feedback. They scale the tax increase back to, say, 8.5 or 9%.
Still really high.
Still painful, but they can present that number as a hard-won compromise. They look like they listened, even though the core structural problem is still there.
And this concept, this performative budgeting, is why this matters to you, the listener, no matter where you pay your municipal taxes. It forces you to question the whole structure of the debate.
You have to ask, is this conversation being engineered to push me toward debating minor personal emotional cuts while the systemic problems driving the cost are just ignored?
Yeah, and the sources highlight this with a really stark comparison point. While Victoria is trying to justify this, 10.44% proposal, their neighbor, the major metropolitan center, Vancouver,
is promising taxpayers a 0% budget increase in 2026.
0%. That number alone just creates this immediate, unavoidable question, doesn't it?
It really does. Is Victoria so poorly managed? Or is there some fundamental difference in their budget structure? If another major city can hit 0, why is Victoria starting at over 10? It just forces a powerful conversation about underlying financial health.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and where the narrative shifts from just talking about cutting things to these deep structural questions. We have to pivot now from the $130,000 cut to the city's overall financial wealth.
Right.
Because if the administration is arguing the budget is so tight they have to slash an iconic feature, how can they also claim they can't find $130,000 when they have this significant accumulated wealth?
And we have the exact figures.
We do. From the Statement of Financial Information for the end of 2024, the accumulated surplus for the city, it stood at slightly over $1 billion.
A billion with a B.
That's a staggering amount of accumulated wealth.
It is. It's a massive number. But here is where we need to introduce some critical nuance for you.
Yeah.
We have to make a vital distinction about what surplus actually means in municipal finance.
Okay.
Almost 3/4 of that $1 billion. It was equity and capital assets.
Wait, okay, so is that $1 billion in cash that the city can just dip into for, street cleaners and, yes, flower baskets? Or is that like saying the theoretical value of City Hall, all the roads, the sewers, All that is counted.
That is exactly the right question to ask, and it's the latter.
I see.
Think of it like your personal finances, right? You might have $400,000 of equity in your house, but you can't use that equity to buy groceries today.
Right, it's tied up. It's not liquid.
It's tied up in non-liquid, long-term assets. That capital asset equity isn't cash you can use for day-to-day operating expenses like a flower program.
Okay, but what about the rest?
Well, this is the key. When you analyze the remaining portion, the part that is liquid and designated as cash, it is still monumental. We're talking about $300 million.
$700 million.
About $300 million, yeah. It consists of 12 separate cash reserves and investments.
So $300 million in accessible funds, and we're talking about finding $130,000.
I mean, do the math.
It's less than 0.04 of a single percentage point of those reserves. It's nothing.
Precisely. And look, these reserves are designated for specific things. There's a financial stability reserve, a climate action reserve, and others. They aren't just in a checking account, but they are accessible and ultimately discretionary.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, though. Aren't reserves there specifically for emergencies to avoid this kind of situation? You're suggesting they tap them, but isn't it more fiscally responsible to save that money for a genuine crisis?
That's the core tension, and the sources really highlight it. Yes, reserve funds are vital for long-term health, absolutely, but the question becomes about priority and political will. If the city is holding $300 million in accessible liquid reserves and investments, why this intense, focused debate on a tiny $130,000 cut? It makes you think. If the choice is between decimating an iconic city feature and touching a fraction of % of your reserves, what story are you trying to sell?
So the ability to spend the money is there.
It's clearly there. But the willingness or, the political decision to set a precedent of using reserves for operating costs, that's what's really being debated here.
The narrative just changes completely once you realize they have the money. It stops being a story about we have to cut the flowers because we're broke.
Right.
And it starts being a story about priorities and structural control. So if they could find the money in reserves and avoid this whole spectacle, and they choose not to, that tells us the 10.44% tax hike is being driven by something much, much deeper.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's transition now to what the sources identify as the true structural cost driver in this whole budget. Labor. This is the big one.
This is the figure that should stop you in your tracks. The source material uses this language, and it's frankly accurate. Labor costs account for a mind-boggling 54% of the operating budget.
54%. Wow. So more than half of every single dollar going out the door for operations is for salaries, wages, and benefits.
That's it. When you have a single cost driver that massive, you understand the pressure on the budget immediately. There's almost no flexibility.
Think about what that implies for management. Right. If the council needs to find, say, even a modest 5% cut in the operating budget, where does it come from?
Where can it come from? If 54 cents of every dollar is already spoken for by staff, the only meaningful place to find cuts is by reducing staff or controlling wage growth. You've got no other real levers to pull beyond what the sources call rationalizing a rapidly growing staff payroll.
And that phrase, rationalizing a rapidly growing staff payroll, is just. It's political jargon for we have to look at cutting staff.
Through attrition, restructuring, whatever it is. Yeah.
So this confirms it. The real money problem is not the flower baskets. It's the size and the cost of the bureaucracy itself.
And this is where the staffing growth becomes a major point of criticism in the source material. They give a very specific and frankly astonishing example of this expansion. We're talking about a city that's trying to justify a huge tax hike and service cuts, yet its communications and engagement department now has 22 staff members.
22. In one department for communications. That's less like a department and more like a small army.
It's a significant investment. And to put that growth into perspective for you, the sources show that is twice as many staff as they had in 2021.
Doubled in just a few years.
Doubled. It raises huge questions about, function creep. What is the operational output of 24 communication staff? Are they truly essential for core city services, police, fire, roads, water? Or are they mostly managing the city's image and generating internal reports?
And what's really interesting is that this staffing growth is happening even as they're preparing to record and analyze views on this very budget. The cycle feeds itself.
It does.
They hire more people to communicate about the budget, which increases the budget, which then requires more communication. Yeah. And residents, by the way, have until 11:459 p.m. on January 23rd to submit their feedback on all of this.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, to that Vancouver comparison, The debate has to move beyond just internal staffing. It becomes about whether council should be looking at deeper efficiencies, maybe service integration across the region, to manage these kinds of costs.
Right. Why is every municipality duplicating all these functions?
When regional collaboration might be more efficient, it's a valid question.
So let's synthesize this. What does all of this mean for you, the listener? We've covered two starkly parallel narratives from the sources. First, there's the visible, emotional, and performative debate over the flowers and the tax rate. And second, there's this deeper structural issue, massive dominant staffing costs, and the big question of how to responsibly manage a billion-dollar surplus with $300 million in liquid cash.
And the ultimate question for the city is, how do you govern within realistic, fiscally responsible means when the political will to address your single largest cost driver just seems to be missing?
So the core critique from the sources is that this entire debate needs to move past the flowers.
It has to. It needs to move beyond that performative issue to address the actual structural cost drivers. And that means tackling service integration with other jurisdictions and, crucially, addressing those rapidly growing staffing levels. That's the 54%. Any serious conversation about controlling the tax rate has to start with labor.
Okay, let's quickly reiterate those striking figures just for memory retention, because these are the nuggets you can use to cut through the noise.
Let's do it. A 10.44% tax hike is on the table.
They're cutting a $130,000 program.
They have a $1 billion accumulated surplus, but remember, only $300 million of that is liquid reserve cash.
And the big one, labor accounts for a staggering 54% of all operating costs.
Those are the numbers to remember.
And understanding these mechanisms, it helps you cut through the noise when your own local government presents its budget. When a council targets some small emotional item for a cut-a-park bench, library hours, whatever, you now know to ask the question.
What are you trying to distract us from?
Exactly. What structural issue, what major cost driver is this a distraction from? Look for the 54% labor cost, not the $130,000 flower basket line item. And here is a final provocative thought for you to consider, based on the material we covered today. Given that large amount of liquid reserves available, that $300 million, and the relatively minor impact a small drawdown would have, is this focus on service cuts and staffing really about long-term fiscal health?
Or is it something else?
Or is the primary motivator simply an unwillingness to use existing cash for short-term relief, because tapping into those reserves just once sets a powerful and politically costly precedent? What are the true political costs of using those reserve funds versus the very real pain of a 10.44% tax hike? That is something worth mulling over.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another stack of sources and another conversation you need to hear.